The old world stood on the verge of collapse, not from armies or beasts or dark gods returned from forgotten ages, but from the collision of ideologies embodied by two titanic figures whose mere existence warped the very rules of magic and destiny. One was a man born of prophecy, raised in shadows, whose quiet wisdom and quiet pain belied a power the likes of which the world had not seen in 1,000 years. The other was a war wizard born of rage and will, forged in the fires of struggle, and honed by the burden of truth and justice. Merlin, Richard Rahl. They came from different worlds, different philosophies. Yet fate, ever the cruel scribe of mortal and myth alike, saw fit to place them on a path that could only end with one standing. The rift that opened between their realms was not merely physical, it was ideological. Magic in Albion was secretive, feared, and constrained by ancient law. In the Midlands and Dahara, it was a weapon, a tool of conquest and clarity. Where Merlin had learned restraint through humility, Richard had learned dominance through necessity. But magic itself had begun to fray, an imbalance caused by the interweaving of laws from two realms not meant to overlap. Creatures from both sides were slipping through the seams of reality, and with each passing day, more was lost. Villages vanished into temporal voids. Rivers flowed backward. Stars blinked and returned with alien constellations. Something had to give. The Conclave of the Infinite Flame, a council older than time, a gathering of ethereal minds that watched over the balance between realms, had summoned both. Not to plead for their help, but to offer a warning. The world, the eldest flame had said, its voice a whisper of dying suns, cannot sustain two truths. The sword of truth and the voice of Emrys are both keystones. Two cannot stand where only one is meant to anchor the weave of reality. Richard had stepped forward first. If it's power you fear, I can walk away from it. I've never asked for this. I wield the sword to protect, not rule. Merlin's reply came quietly. The problem is not who rules, but what truth rules. Yours demands clarity. Mine thrives in ambiguity. But the world is not absolute, Richard. And truth without mercy becomes tyranny. It was not said as a challenge, but the words stung nonetheless. Richard was no tyrant, but he had killed, he had judged, he had chosen who lived and who died there based on his unwavering belief in right and wrong. Merlin, by contrast, had kept secrets that allowed evil to flourish, sacrificed the few for the many, and stood aside when action could have saved lives. He bore the weight of every death he allowed, but he bore it silently. The philosophical divide widened. Richard's eyes narrowed. So we allow monsters to live because we're afraid of being monsters ourselves? No, Merlin replied. We allow them to live because someday, someone must believe they can be something more. Richard scoffed. That's not wisdom. That's cowardice wrapped in poetry. And your truth, Merlin said, eyes glowing faintly gold, is brutality dressed as righteousness. The Conclave watched in silence. Two paths, both with merit, both with consequence. But only one could survive the convergence. The world was unraveling, and the only way to bind it was to crown one ideology as absolute. Truth or mercy, power or wisdom, sword or soul. The setting of the final battle was chosen, a place where both magics intertwined violently. The Nexus of origin, a shattered plateau suspended between realms, where the sky was both day and night, and time bent like heat above flame. The air was thick with the ghosts of forgotten spells. Every step echoed with the screams of things erased from history. Here, no mortal could survive long, but these two were far beyond mortal. Richard arrived first, the sword of truth pulsing in his hand like a heartbeat. Lightning danced across the edge, and with every step, the ground bent to his will. His presence was dominance incarnate, not arrogant, but immutable. The kind of presence that made weaker men bow before even drawing their weapons. Merlin came after, cloaked in a simple robe, no weapon visible. His eyes were weary, but his steps were calm. The wind curled around him like a loyal servant. The dragons in the cracks of space stirred as his essence touched the Nexus. Even the Conclave, watching unseen, whispered among themselves. some hoping for his triumph, others fearing what might rise if mercy proved victorious. Before either could raise a hand, Richard spoke. "You knew it would come to this." Merlin nodded. "Yes, because power that justifies itself eventually demands sacrifice. And someone must say, no more." Richard tightened his grip. "Then you'll fall for your sentiment. And you," Merlin said, a small smile on his lips, "may win and still lose everything." The words hovered like an incantation, a truth neither could deny. For Merlin knew that victory was not simply defeating an enemy. It was preserving the soul of a world that could still choose compassion over vengeance. Both were right, both were wrong, and yet both were necessary. But in a world unraveling under the strain of two opposing truths, only one could remain. The wind screamed, the ground groaned, magic surged, and with a single blink, the battle began. The moment the battle began, the world seemed to draw in its breath. Richard Rahl exploded forward with the fury of a war storm. The sword of truth blazed in his grip like a shard of pure lightning torn from the heavens, every swing tearing the fabric of the Nexus with soundless explosions of power. As he charged, time itself stuttered around him, his additive magic warping perception, amplifying speed, reflex, and precision. Each step shattered the ancient stone beneath him, as if it had wronged him personally. Merlin did not move to meet him. He raised his hand slowly, and the earth obeyed. The path before Richard twisted violently, reshaping itself into a wall of obsidian spires that surged up like daggers from the core of the Nexus. Richard did not slow. He carved through them with a swing of his blade, each strike leaving behind a trail of annihilated matter. Magic trembled before the sword. Merlin could see it, feel it. That weapon did not simply cut, it negated. The very structure of enchantment unraveled in its wake. But Merlin was no stranger to gods or monsters. He was born to magic, a creature of it. Where Richard mastered power through will, Merlin became one with it through understanding. He whispered a word in the language of stars and vanished as Richard's sword cleaved the air where he had been. He reappeared above, suspended in wind and thought, his eyes aglow with raw, ancient power. Lightning crackled around his arms, not summoned, but asked, and it answered. He directed it downward, a cascade of blinding arcs that sought to bind Richard in a cage of thunder. Richard raised his sword, and the lightning shattered harmlessly across the unseen barrier of his subtractive magic. It did not simply resist, it consumed. The air smelled of ozone and something old or something wrong. Richard hurled his voice upward. "Is this it, Merlin? Parlor tricks and pretty lights?" Merlin's expression did not change. He descended slowly, the wind obeying his posture. "You mistake restraint for weakness." The ground around Richard erupted in a forest of illusionary doubles, each a perfect replica of Merlin, casting divergent spells that rained down fire, wind, ice, and binding light. Richard twisted, slashing through the falsehoods with impossible speed. His senses, honed beyond human capacity, could tell illusion from truth. But for every one he struck down, another took its place. 1,000 variations, 1,000 possibilities, and only one real Merlin. The sword began to hum with fury. It resonated with Richard's anger, feeding it back to him, amplifying his presence until even the illusions recoiled. With a shout that split the air, he unleashed a wave of force that broke through every copy, a pulse of brutal clarity that dispelled all deception. Merlin was revealed in the center, hands extended, not in defense, but in offering. And then the sky darkened. Richard felt it immediately. The magic had changed. It was no longer elemental, no longer clean. It was old. Merlin spoke the language of the old religion, words that were not commands, but invitations. The sky answered, shadows that had no source gathered. A dragon's roar echoed in the fabric of the realm, not a beast of flesh, but of memory. Merlin's eyes burned gold, and behind them danced something timeless. "I do not fight to win," Merlin said quietly. "I fight to remind you what you were before the world taught you to divide." Richard's jaw clenched. "I don't need reminders. I need results." "You confuse clarity with truth," Merlin replied. "But truth is not always sharp. Sometimes it is soft. Sometimes it forgives." Richard charged again, This time Merlin met him. The air collapsed between them. Spells collided with pure, unfiltered will. The sword of truth tore through barriers of time, shredded runes of binding, split constructs made of light and shadow alike. Richard struck with the full power of a war wizard, battle-forged, absolute, and unstoppable. Merlin matched him, not in force but in flow. Every blow was diverted, every spell redirected. Merlin's magic was not rigid, it bent. It curved around Richard's strikes like water around stone, reshaping the field with every movement. He summoned memories of futures that had not happened and used them as weapons. He bent regret into shields. He forged the hopes of the dead into blades of light. And still Richard pressed forward. Then came the turning point. Richard, driven by fury and necessity, cast a sphere of subtractive magic at Merlin's chest. A sphere designed not to kill, but to erase. To remove Merlin from all time, all space, to unmake him from the root of reality. It struck, and it did nothing. Merlin stood, surrounded not by a shield, but by acceptance. The spell dispersed across him like mist upon the sea. It was not resistance, it was not defiance. It was surrender. Merlin looked into Richard's eyes and whispered, "You cannot unmake what has already let go." Richard staggered, the sword faltered. In that instant, the battle ceased to be physical. They stood now in a mindscape, a bridge of thought where power gave way to belief. The Conclave watched in silence as two truths faced each other, bare and unflinching. "You think mercy is strength," Richard said. "I know it is," Merlin replied. "But what if the enemy doesn't change?" "Then I change," Merlin said, "because I will not become them." Richard's voice cracked. "But how many die in the meantime?" Merlin's answer came not in words, but in presence. A flood of visions, not created but remembered. Lives saved not by killing, but by waiting. Tyrants undone not by blades, but by the courage of those who believed in a better way. A world that endured not because of power, but because someone chose not to use it. Richard fell to one knee. The sword dimmed. "I never had that choice," he whispered. "You do now," Merlin said. The mindscape collapsed. They returned to the Nexus. Both battered, both changed. Richard rose slowly. His blade no longer hummed. He sheathed it. "You win," he said. "Not bitter, not broken, but understanding." Merlin nodded, his shoulders heavy. "No, we all do, if we choose to learn." The Conclave stirred. The balance shifted. The Nexus stabilized. Reality began to weave itself whole again, slower now, more gently. Merlin had not won by overpowering Richard. He had won by outlasting him, by reminding him. And in doing so, he saved not only the world, but Richard as well.